Thanks everyone for coming to this. It's really nice to see a very healthy participant list on this webinar. I'm really pleased to be able to present the results of this long survey project to the community. So a little bit about what we're going to do today. I'm going to give a few more preliminary introductions. I'm going to go over the goals and the context of the survey, and then we'll get into the key findings, really the meat of the presentation. And this is kind of like a walkthrough, essentially the most interesting things that I found that came out of the survey. It's certainly not all the details that came out of the survey. There's lots to dig into in the report if you're interested in. I'll touch on some acknowledgements, and then I do want to talk about what's next for the Digital Preservation Working Group, what kinds of things we're investigating that came out of the survey. And as Lise mentioned, there will also be lots of time for questions at the end. So first of all, who does this disembodied voice belong to? As Lisa kindly introduced me, my name is Grant Hurley. I was born and raised in New Brunswick on unceded Passamaquoddy territory. I then spent a long time in graduate school at the University of British Columbia. For people who love school, graduate school is never quite enough. You can always do more. And so I did an English degree there, and then completed my Master of Library and Information Studies and Master of Archival Studies at UBC, and loved living out west. But since I moved to Toronto in 2015, and I've been working at Scholars Portal at the University of Toronto since 2016. For those of you who don't know, Scholars Portal is essentially a collaborative technology service provider for members of the Ontario Council of University Libraries. And so we provide shared technology resources to members of OCL, and for my part, that includes digital preservation services. So I head up our trustworthy digital repository for journals, content, and I'm also the service manager for the Permafrost hosted digital preservation service. It's been a delight working at Scholars Portal, and one of the projects that I was able to take on as part of my role has been working as a member of the Digital Preservation Working Group since 2017, primarily on this service, on the survey project. So what were the goals of the survey? One was to establish a clear picture of the current state of digital preservation activities among memory institutions in Canada. There have been previous efforts in this work. The Canadian Heritage Information Network conducted a survey in 2011. And Lana Mayer also conducted a survey in 2013 and 14. And I'd really encourage you to take a look at the results of both of those surveys. They do provide interesting points of comparison for the work that was done here. A second goal was to identify gaps in capacity and needs at institutions, to figure out where resources could be directed in particular, inform potential research projects, and inform opportunities for collaboration among memory institutions in Canada. So we worked with a particular assumption when it came to the meaning of digital preservation. And this was presented to respondents of the survey, and it also informed the creation of the survey. And this is one that comes from the Digital Preservation Coalition. And they say digital preservation is the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. And so there's a few interesting sort of pieces here to me. So digital preservation essentially, according to this definition, is really a process. These are activities that are happening over time. And it's really about ensuring continued access into the future. So a preservation program is really predicated on materials of value that need to be accessed for as long as that access is required. And in some cases, that access may be indefinite into the future. For other materials, particularly things like organizational records, there may be a retention period. So that access is required perhaps for a shorter period. But we're always sort of working to encourage continued accessibility of our valuable resources. So similar to this, when we were developing the survey, a great source of inspiration was Anne Kenny and Nancy McGovern's three-legged stool metaphor for digital preservation. And this is similar. It's the idea that digital preservation work involves activities across a number of areas. It's not simply about implementing technology, for example. Technology, of course, is quite important to digital preservation work. You certainly need hardware, you need storage infrastructure, software, networks in order to accomplish this work. But I'm sure we all know that technology really can't just run itself. It requires people with skills and resources, and an organization that's committed to funding those people and building those skills. And that organization must have a mandate and commitment to preserve the materials under their care and support staff and their work with guidance through policies and planning, for example. And so when we built the survey, we really focused out on identifying various areas across an organization where preservation work can happen, and I'll delve into that in a second. We had quite positive response to the survey, 52 respondents in total. There were 26 academic CARL members, so CARL member libraries, essentially. There were 7 academic libraries who were not members of CARL. So in total, 33 respondents came from the academic sector, which made for 63% of the respondents in total. There are 14 government-based organizations, including one of those who is a CARL member. And there are 5 community-based or nonprofit organizations. So as I mentioned, the survey was organized around a bunch of thematic areas, which tried to identify essentially preservation supporting activities, across these areas. And so these include collections, of course, the materials that are the subject of preservation, activities around organizational commitments, so things at the sort of higher organizational level, policies and procedures that support preservation work, document activities, tools and applications, of course, for performing digital preservation activities, access, so ensuring means of ensuring access to digital materials, whether those be online repositories or other more lo-fi methods. Storage, of course, you need somewhere to maintain digital materials into the future. And finally, staffing and funding. So obviously the big part of the work that involves people to do it. And there are a few concluding questions as well. For most of the key sections, there were a set of gaps and challenges responses that institutions could select. And so essentially we provided them with a predetermined list of gaps and challenges we thought they may identify with. They also had the option to add extra ones. And during this webinar, I'm going to touch on some of the ones that were selected most heavily by respondents. Oh, I think I missed a slide. Let's see here. Aha, the survey timeline. I must have skipped over that. So the survey was developed in summer of 2017. We released it in phases. So phase 1 was just released to CARL members between October and December 2017. And the second phase was released in August to September 2018. Those targeted a broader set of Canadian memory organizations. So any heritage institution, memory organization in Canada that felt that they wanted to give a response, and that's how we brought in government-based members, which included as well public libraries, museums, galleries, a variety of nonprofit organizations. Because of this phased approach, it introduced some complications, one of which was that CARL members submitted additional responses to the second phase. And so we decided to take advantage of their initiative to provide an update, essentially, and reached out to anyone who hadn't submitted an update as part of phase 2 and asked them to provide one, and pretty much everybody did. So that's why we have that sort of December 2018 and January 2019 update phase. At the end of that, it was all merged into a final data set. If you're interested in the individual results from the phases, there was a presentation by myself at the At Risk North 2 forum back in November 2018 in Montreal. And there are phase 1 and 2 interim reports that we published as well. And all of those are linked through the At-Risk North 2 page, which is linked through these slides as well. But the big event, of course, was the publication of a final report. Just recently, in November 2019, there's also an accompanying a redacted data set and a codebook. And the report and codebook are both available in French and English. So that is where you'll find the bulk of the information about the results of this survey. All right, as I say, it's time for some facts. So, one of the first takeaways, all respondents have digital collections, and they have quite a lot of them. So all respondents to the survey have digitized materials in their collections. So everybody's got digital assets of some form. 94% are also acquiring born digital materials. So these could come in many forms. University archives, for example, accepting materials from donors. Libraries perhaps acquiring materials that only exist in digital form. And interestingly, those that are not acquiring born digital materials, and these are primarily archives, said that they are not acquiring these materials because they don't have the preservation capacity to keep them. In terms of the quantity of data, collections, data, and storage, the median amount was 20 terabytes. 45 of the 52 respondents, about 87%, could give an approximate quantity of data and storage. So, most respondents could give some kind of number. The amount of data and storage in total kind of fell into a few ranges. 17 had between 0 and 10 terabytes. A bit more, 21 had between 10 and 100 terabytes. A small number had between 100 and 400 terabytes, and then there was an outlier with 3,720 terabytes, which is quite a lot of data. So I'm not entirely sure if that number is correct or not, but that's as it was received. And that's why I used the median amount of 20 to represent what's generally in storage among the respondents. So it's fair to say that all respondents have some range of digital collections, and the quantity is not small. 20 terabytes is not big in like the big data world, but it does represent a pretty strong amount of material, possibly many thousands of items depending on what's being held. And if we look at content types in collections, you can see that most respondents indicate that if they've got pretty high combinations of a variety of materials. Moving images, collections of photos, of course, being very common, audio, and then private papers, other kinds of records from individual donors, perhaps, as well as organizational records coming from the organization itself. And then below that, lots of the kinds of materials that we commonly see in library collections, things like purchased publications, research data, theses, purchased data sets. A little bit lower on the list, things like web archives, but even that was at 55%. So, most of the institutions responding are collecting quite a wide variety of materials. So we have, pretty strong collections in Canada, but in general, these collections are not being managed according to preservation-friendly practices. And this is why. So, in terms of storage in particular, we looked at what types of storage were in use by respondents. And most respondents are relying on a combination of local network storage, the servers hosted by your IT unit, external media like removable hard drives, USB sticks, possibly floppy disks, other kinds of legacy media, and CDs and DVDs. It's a small typo there, CDs and DVDs. So 81% of respondents selected one of these options, and 38% of respondents selected all three. And the main concern here is that these storage methods are considered risky for preservation, particularly for media like CDs and DVDs or hard drives that degrade and they're easily damaged, especially in the case of there just being the one copy on that one medium. So if your only copy of a digital asset that you have in your collections is on a hard drive. Somebody drops that hard drive, it's quite possible you've lost those materials permanently. So that's why most preservation practitioners really encourage keeping multiple copies, ideally in different physical locations, often on different media as well, different potentially file systems or other kinds of storage methods. And so when we looked at usage of those kinds of preservation-friendly storage methods, we found that usage was falling at 50% or below. So 50% of institutions or respondents using cloud storage networks or tape, both of which are considered more friendly for preservation. And 35% were using replicated storage networks like locks, for example. And so while local servers and other media are always going to have a role to play, in digital preservation work, of course, you need access to that kind of storage for all sorts of purposes. It is worrisome that respondents might be relying on these as the only places where they're storing other valuable collections. There are also some interesting insights that came out of a question about proportions of assets stored on different media. So this is trying to get a bit more information about what quantities of materials are being stored on different kinds of media. So here you can see that 33% of digital assets are stored on average on external media like hard drives, CDs, and so on. 2% on internal media, and this would be like a donor's personal computer or some other kind of hard drive that's within an existing system. Not as much, but still something. And 65% on network systems. So this connects with another question that we had around the use of tools for digital forensics. And these tools enable safe capture from media like hard drives, floppy disks, and so on. And while digital forensics processes aren't required for lots of collections, it's a pretty sort of high touch, high labor kind of activity, mainly used for born digital donations of archival materials, for example, where context is very important. The low use of these forensic tools, 29% respondents, does point to potential challenges in safely retrieving content from external media. So on the same note around tools for preservation, we also asked if respondents are using any one tool for preservation processing. And so preservation processing are activities like running checksums, creating bags, which is another way of implementing checksums in a preservation workflow, and activities like file format identification or validation, perhaps normalization or migration. So converting copies of files under your care into preservation or access formats. And the survey really shows that the use of these tools is not very widespread. 21% of respondents overall are using any one tool for preservation processing in production. So that means using it as part of an active, daily or relatively frequent use. More respondents were using tools in testing. So there was another 27% that had any one tool that they were using in a test basis. So in general, there's broader use of tools, but very small use of these tools as sort of established functions. Now this stands in contrast to the section that focused on access. 96% of respondents to the survey provide access to their digital collections in one way or another. And that includes things like web repositories, shared folders, or dedicated computer terminals at their physical institution. And this obviously presents a problem where preservation supports access. If we look back to that Digital Preservation Coalition definition, I think that's a fair claim to make. And so if you lose these materials from a disaster or some kind of error, it makes it very difficult to provide access to them. And so prioritizing access obviously is part of the mission of all of our institutions, and rightly so. But not focusing on any methods for preservation does introduce risks to maintaining that access. So another big area of focus and a big area of interest for me is around staffing. And the basic conclusion we can draw from the report, from the survey, is that very few people are doing this work in Canada at the moment. I want to present staffing numbers in a few different ways here. But one finding that I'd like to sort of emphasize up front is the proportion of staffing for digital preservation in contrast to broader total staffing at respondent organizations. So we asked survey respondents to submit positions, to list positions that support digital preservation work along estimates of the FTEs dedicated to this work. So, give a job title and give the general FTE related to digital preservation. This is always, of course, going to be approximate. Somebody's saying, oh, well, this person in this role probably does, 30% of their time. 30% of their time is devoted towards digital preservation work. That's, of course, always going to be a ballpark. But having these values on hand overall across all of the respondents was quite revealing. And so I totaled up the FTEs represented in the survey responses and then compared them to total FTEs of those respondent organizations. So for CARL members, we have the benefit of CARL's published statistics, which provide FTE values for the libraries that are CARL members. And for non-CARL members in the survey, they were asked to report, self-report FTEs, total FTEs at their organizations. And so we found that on average, staff with responsibilities for digital preservation represent 0.77% of all staff FTEs at respondent organizations. So putting that another way, for every 100 staff members at an organization who responded to the survey, less than one of them is supporting digital preservation work in some way. And that's equivalent across all the staff listed. So the equivalent of less than one person is doing this work. These are similar statistics, essentially stated in a different way. So 38% of the survey respondents have the equivalent of one full-time individual working on digital preservation across all staff listed with responsibilities in this area. So the total staff FTEs added up equaled 1 for just under 40%. Fewer, 18%, have at least one full-time individual supporting digital preservation work. So 18% of the respondents had one or more people in a full-time capacity doing this work. So a little less than 1 in 5. Another interesting statistic here was the percentage of FTE assigned to roles. And so across all the roles that were listed, all the roles with FTEs assigned, 48% of those were between 0 and 20% FTE, which is interesting in my view, because it means that at less than 20% FTE, if your job is 1 day a week essentially for digital preservation, possibly averaged, of course, across all of your days, it can be hard to do this work on that basis. There's definitely a need at institutions for many people to be doing this kind of work, and some more involved than others, and it always depends, of course, on the institutional context, requirements of that institution to support this work. So not every institution needs a full-time person working on this kind of thing, perhaps, but it may be spread across multiple roles. But it is revealing that just under half of all the roles listed had this level of responsibility assigned. There was some optimism, I would say, around increasing staffing. So 48%, 25 respondents said they expected to increase staffing through new hires or reassignment. So just under half do intend to grow their proportion of work in this area in the coming future. And there are different methods for increasing staffing selected. So 10 respondents selected both new hires and assigning current staff. 40%, 8 or 32% said reassigning current staff only, and 7 said they were going to be hiring new people only. All right, moving on to policies and procedures. the basic takeaway here is that policies in particular, procedures to a lesser extent, are not being particularly well documented. They're not being produced. On the policy side, then this means, when I say policy, it means generally higher level documents indicating priorities, outlining responsibilities and scope. You can look to the report for examples of digital preservation policies and the kind of level they treat. There's details in there about how different organizations are approaching the question of like what a policy should do. But in general, this means a fairly high level document kind of guiding a program, contributing to things like planning and responsibilities. Here, 17% of respondents have published digital preservation policies, and 19% have policies in review or in draft form. And the rest were either in discussion or hadn't started. And so I think it's fair to say here that there's a fairly low proportion of institutions with policies from the survey. Things are a bit more promising in the area of procedures and workflows. And so procedures and workflows tend to be more detailed, of course. They're really focusing on the how of this kind of work, the doing. And they tend to be more flexible, can change more often too as you implement new technologies, change your practices in one way or another. And so 23% of respondents have procedures that are documented in some way. And quite a few more, 48%, have procedures that are in development or draft form. And so that's a better state of affairs in some ways, in that institutions are interested in writing down procedures and workflows, even if that's in a sort of draft way. So somebody is documenting essentially what work is being done. And now I should add here that there's a lot of nuance that could be brought to the policy conversation that just didn't really accomplish in the context of the survey. Some respondents indicated that they have multiple policies, for example, at different levels of sort of completion. And so they could only sort of answer one, they could say whether they had published policies or not. So they couldn't really add that extra nuance there. So there's opportunities here potentially for the future to delve a bit more deep into the state of policies. But in general, I think it's fair to say that policies are generally not well produced. They're certainly not in a published form. Procedures are looking a little bit better. There was a question near the end that focused on areas of preservation concern. And the question was, what digital assets do you wish you could preserve but currently cannot? And this was a free text question, so there were a whole bunch of different kinds of responses. But the main areas of concern were web-based content, things like public websites of the institution, internal websites as well, like intranets and things like that, websites of student organizations, for example, at an institution, as well as local news sources, which several institutions expressed interest in preserving. After that were organizational records, so all those materials that come from within the organization itself. I think there was a pretty strong proportion of respondents who have university archives responsible for organizational records. Of course, most of those are in digital form, and I get the sense that preservation of these is a big concern. This was followed by research data, perennial area of interest, and digital audiovisual carriers. So these are digital media that hold audiovisual materials. And finally, email. I mentioned earlier on that we had respondents select gaps and challenges. And these were each associated with different areas of inquiry in the survey. And they could add their own as well. So these are the top gaps and challenges that were selected. The top 5, I guess 6, 2 were tied. And they really resonate with of course, with the other parts of the survey. So on the policy side, the top one was lack of time and resources for policy development. So it's obvious here that policy development is a concern. Institutions are aware that policies are not in a great state of affairs. So we had 41 respondents out of 52, almost 80% select that as an option. Right up there as well with staffing. So the gap and challenge selected there was lack of funding for new positions. So there is a desire to create new positions for this kind of work, but few resources with which to hire. Followed that were procedures and workflows again, interest in documenting these kinds of things, a lack of time and resources for procedure documentation. At the level of the organization, 33 respondents selected lack of resources to pursue organizational change. So here, feeling that shifting the organization towards doing this kind of work requires resources itself, requires advocacy, for example, often time and resources to get projects up and running. And so many institutions, 33, selected this as an option, as a challenge. And finally, there were gaps and challenges around the use of specific tools at about just over half respondents. So lack of staff knowledge and skills to employ digital forensics tools, and lack of money to support preservation processing tools. All right, so there is some good news in all this. You may think that some the responses have been a little bit, negative, but there were positive things that came out of the survey as well. One of these is that organizations are at least committed in a broad sense to doing this kind of work. So 79% of respondents, 41 of the 52, have some kind of language expressing commitment to digital preservation, published, awaiting approval, drafted, or planned. You can see in the chart there that 38% have language in a strategic plan, a mission statement, or the kind of guiding document published. And everyone else has, not quite everyone else seems to have intentions to do so if it's not quite published yet. 21% had no language at all. Similarly, 81% of respondents have an individual or group responsible for coordinating digital preservation activities across the organization. So there is someone at that organization, either usually a manager, supervisor, administrator, or potentially a group like a preservation working group or established committee, who's responsible for seeing what's happening around digital preservation work across the organization, across multiple potential departments or units, and then is responsible for trying to coordinate that work. So that's a very good thing if there is a person or a group who's responsible for seeing what's going on. Another very interesting and positive thing, I think, is that 75% of respondents indicated participation in regional, national, or international organizations, conferences, or projects specific to digital preservation. So by and large, 3/4 of the respondents are involved in one project, most often more than one project or initiative around digital preservation work. So, there are lots of opportunities for collaboration. There are many organizations and projects very active right now around this kind of work. Out of interest, there were 49 distinct entities that were mentioned by respondents to this question. So 49 distinct groups, organizations, conferences, what have you. And 44% of these are mentioned just once. So there seems to be quite a diversity. Some of these groups serve specific sectors or another. For example, obviously very strong support for consortia in Canada here, as well as organizations like Carl. I don't know if there was some bias there. CRCAN, of course, projects like LOCKS, CLOCKS. You can look at the survey report to see every organization that was listed, as well as the number of times they were mentioned. And that might be interesting to some of you out there. But in general, it seems to me that there's lots of opportunities to do this work collaboratively. And some of the work going forward might be possibly coordinating some of this work among the many, many actors in this space. Now, there's some analysis at the end of the report that also is quite interesting to me. And that involved creating a scoring rubric as a way of comparing responses across the different functional areas. It's pretty rudimentary and really focused on the results themselves. I didn't develop, much broader kind of like assessment framework for organizations doing digital preservation. There are wonderful frameworks like that out there already. But it did provide a way of comparing responses across these areas according to strengths and weaknesses. And so it ended up with a score out of 15 for each respondent. And one question that was posed during discussions of the DPWG around this work was, what's the relationship between an institution's overall resources and its ability to do digital preservation work? Does this kind of work require you to be a well-resourced institution, large budget, large amount of staff? And so the results actually counter this notion. The charts here show that materials expenditures, for example, that was one value I looked at, against scores, show that there actually isn't a very strong relationship between the two. So the chart on the left shows materials expenditures for CARL members against the general preservation capacity score that I developed. The chart on the right was for non-CARL members, and that was based on their budget range. So, not entirely comparable figures, but sufficed for this experiment. And you can see, in fact, that some of the highest scoring respondents have relatively low materials expenditures. Now, of course, there are some that have both, right? But it's not a precursor. In fact, for CARL members, 5 of the top 10 scores actually fell below the median materials expenditure value for all respondents. So 5 of the 10 fell below that median materials expenditure value. And I think the same can be said for the non-CARL members as well when it comes to budget ranges. We also did a similar analysis with another metric around FTE values, so total FTEs, which you can find in the report as well, and it really shows the same kind of relationship there. So in summary, there are some strengths to build on in this work. Organizations seem to be at least committed to doing this work, if not in practice, then certainly on paper. They're communicating that interest through language in their strategic plans, mission statements, and things like that. As I mentioned, there are many opportunities for collaboration. There seems to be a great amount of interest in collaboration, and I think no one would argue that working together to perform this kind of work is really necessary, either on the level of sharing knowledge up to things like shared technical infrastructures. There are procedures in draft. People are documenting what they're doing, which is not a bad thing. I think this sort of work, procedure documentation always requires some flexibility. So the fact that the majority have it in draft, fewer, but still significant amount have it documented is a really good step. And finally, I think while being a well-resourced institution can help you build a digital preservation program, it's definitely not a requirement for doing so. We have to remember that doing this kind of work is always proportional to the institution that wants to perform it. So a large institution with large collections will need, large amount of resources to preserve them. Small institution with small amounts of collection will need equivalent resources. And considering what practices to implement, what tools to use is always proportional to the materials at hand. So I think there is promise in that area. This isn't restricted to just those big institutions. The areas of weakness should be pretty obvious to you at this point. Low uses of preservation-friendly storage infrastructures and tools for processing. Very low staffing to do this kind of work in Canada. There really are, it seems like, a handful of full-time people working on this working in this area in this country. And policies are just not well established at this point. So that leads very nicely into what's next for the Digital Preservation Working Group. So as part of our work plan for 2020, we've established 3 new subgroups. And these really came out of the survey directly, so they shouldn't be any surprise to you. The first of these is around policy. And this involves investigating the sort of digital preservation policy stack, so to speak, the levels of different kinds of policies that an institution might put in place around this work, and opportunities for inter-institutional policy support and sharing. things like a potential policy library, for example. I think institutions find it really helpful when they can crib or at least reference the policies of like institutions. And so the work here is really hoping to support that. And the lead of that subgroup is Jeff Harder. Secondly, there's a subgroup focused on infrastructure. And this is scoping out infrastructures in local, regional, provincial levels with the goal of potentially integrating or coordinating services at a national level. So potentially tying together formally or informally those infrastructures that exist already, those many collaborative groups that are currently operating in the space. And the lead on this project is Steve Marks. And finally, there's a group looking at staffing. And this is defining staff roles and identifying applicable and successful job descriptions for supporting digital preservation work. And the lead on that project is Laura Wilson. So before we turn it over to questions, I do want to express deep appreciation to a whole number of individuals who contributed to this project. Certainly couldn't have done it by myself. First of all, I have to thank all of the survey respondents for taking the time to answer our questions. It was by no means a short survey, and I hope that they benefited from the process. There certainly would be no report if folks didn't take the time to fill it out. I want to thank members of the Digital Preservation Working Group for the feedback and encouragement this whole time over the length of the project. And similarly to Carl for their support, especially to Lise for administering the survey. She was extremely, extremely helpful over the whole process and making sure that the survey ran smoothly. I also want to thank Kathleen Shearer, the report's co-author, for her very sage advice and her editing skills. And finally, to Jonathan Dory for his really, really excellent translation of the report into French. Certainly no small task there. Okay, so time for some questions. So I have a few questions for you if you're interested in responding to them. I'm certainly open to questions for me, of course. But I am interested in hearing whether these findings surprise you or confirm your own experiences. How the findings might resonate with your own institutional context or not. And I'm curious, it's a potential area for further research, really, for institutions that are meeting their preservation goals. I'd love to know how they built the preservation programs, what things really work for them. And so I'd be happy to hear about that here, or you're welcome to reach out. And in general, please do reach out to me for any questions about the report. I'm very open to feedback. But for now, I'm here, so please do speak up.
Thanks so much, Grant. That was fantastic. I see that we do have a question in the chat box, and I'm going to let you get to that in just a second. But first, I did want to mention one thing that did not come up in terms of DPWG upcoming efforts. I just wanted to mention that we are going to continue with kind of the side arm of the DPWG, which is QUAC, the Canadian Web Archiving Coalition. And that, in fact, there will be an in-person meeting of QUAC in May. So I'll put a link in the chat box for those who are interested. But for now, I'll let you answer Josie Paquette's question, which is, what is the future of collaboration and web semantics in your opinion?
I might separate those two things. So obviously, as someone who works for Scholars Portal, I'm very biased when it comes to collaboration. I think it's very important. I think it can be used very much to really push forward this work. We're interested, and certainly I'm interested in seeing what levels of collaboration should sort of fall where. Information sharing is one type of collaboration, and it's pretty low key. It can be done pretty easily. There are all sorts of interesting groups focusing on that. More closely tying in preservation infrastructures in a collaborative way is a little harder. That takes agreements and considering things like costs. And so that seems to me where collaboration is going, is the harder stuff, but very necessary stuff around thinking about what kind of infrastructures, for example, are required for a country the size of Canada, for organizations as big as they are here in Canada. So that is where work is heading. When it comes to the semantic web, I'm by no means an expert on that kind of thing. There are wonderful folks, though, within the archives and library community who are contributing great stuff to Wikidata, for example. There have been wonderful presentations as well on linked data and digital preservation metadata, particularly around file formats. And I know there are various projects that play right now around increasing information around file formats and their analysis. So yeah, that's kind of where things seem to be going that area, but I'm not a huge expert. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, and I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a question from Mark Jordan as well.
Yeah, I see that. So did any respondents offer information on how they're assessing their efforts? No. There was one question that you can look at in the report around whether they'd used self-audit. And so that's the using that sort of track self-assessment approach. Small proportion of respondents had done some sort of self-assessment, either with track or some other tool, but they didn't report, the results of those. I think it was about 20-odd% of the respondents had used any one tool for self-assessment. I mean, when it comes to evidence-based validation, like things like, looking at integrity of their materials and storage, for example, I don't believe anyone reported on doing that kind of work. That's not to say it's not happening. And that is a potential future question as well, about whether institutions are sort of doing that validation work in-house. So Michael's asking, how do these results compare to earlier surveys? So the only two earlier surveys within Canada that I'm aware of are the ones I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation from CHIN and Lana Mayer. The questions were a little bit different depending on the interests of the researcher, of course. It's always the way it goes. At the time in 2011, when CHIN was reporting on the survey, for example, the use of cloud infrastructures hadn't even really entered the picture. And so they were feeling very good about the fact that folks were using CDs and DVDs in order to store the digital assets. That now is maybe considered not a good practice. But they also asked questions around preservation functions, for example, like running fixity checks, validation, and practically no one was doing that kind of work. And it seems like very few are doing that work now. Alana Mayer came to the same conclusion. So around the sort of work around preservation processing, integrity, validation, it hasn't really changed that much in the last few years. Yeah, I'd encourage you to take a look at those results though and find other areas of comparison as well, but those are the ones that struck me the most. Michael's following up another question. What about organizational support? Was that a focus in the early ones? No, there weren't really questions around that kind of thing in those early reports that I can recall. I'd have to double check them to take a look, but that was something that I introduced here. Definitely not unique, but really came out of engagement with the three-legged stool concept of digital preservation work being very rooted in organizational culture.
Well, we still have a few minutes. If there's anyone else who's holding on to a question and hesitating to ask it, but if not, I'm sure no one minds leaving a session a few minutes early. So on that note, I am going to thank Grant so very much for all your work on this and for presenting such an enlightening and really quite interesting presentation for us today.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It was a great opportunity to talk about this work more. I really appreciate everyone who took the time to come and listen. And please, as I said, please follow up with me if you have any other questions. And take a look at the report. It's there for your reading pleasure.